All right. Good evening. My name's Colin Forrest. I'm a member of the Council of the Queensland chapter of the Australian Institute of International Affairs that is hosting this wonderful event tonight. I welcome you all here to these rooms at Holding Redlich, our members and our guests and fellow council members. Before I introduce the speakers, of course, I personally acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which this building is built and upon which we therefore meet, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples who have populated this area for many, many millennia. I pay my respects on behalf of all of us to their elders past, present and future. I have the great privilege tonight of introducing one of our other council members, Graham Kerridge. And Graham is going to introduce you to our guest speaker tonight, Mr. David Walker, AM, and they are going to have a wonderful conversation about the book that David Walker and Li Yao, his great Chinese friend, have written together about their friendship, long-standing friendship of many, many years. So I'll I'll call on Graham to introduce David to you all. Over to you, Graham.
Thank you, Colin. My name is Graham Kerridge. I'm also a member of the State Council of AIIA, and may I welcome you here tonight for what I'm sure will be a very fascinating discussion. Now, Professor David Walker is an eminent academic historian who has been a leading authority in the study of Australia's perception of Asia and the history of Australia's engagement with Asia. Amongst his many publications on the area have been Anxious Nation, Australia and the Rise of Asia, 1850 to 1939, and its sequel, Stranded Nation, White Australia in the Asian Region. He has also co-edited a selection of essays on Australia's engagement with Asia titled Australia's Asia, From Yellow Peril to Asian Century. David has held numerous senior posts around Australian universities, including the Alfred Deakin Professor of Australian Studies at Deakin University, the highest honour that the university can bestow on its academic staff. In November 2012, David was appointed as the inaugural PhD Bulletin Professor of Australian Studies at Peking University. This was the first high-profile, privately funded Australian professorial position in China and reflected the commitment at that time to encouraging Australian university students to look to Asia and to gain a fuller understanding of the culture of China as a key partner in Asia. During his time in China, David became close friends with his co-author, Professor Li Yao. Professor Li Yao is a senior member of the Chinese Writers Association who teaches translation at Peking University. He has translated, at last count, 40 Australian books into Chinese, including many of Australia's most prominent writers, such as Patrick White, Peter Carey, Colin McCurrett, Richard Flanagan, Alexis Wright, Alex Miller, and Thomas Keneally, and of course, David himself. The book that they wrote together with the support of David's wife, Karen, herself a prominent academic, who's also here tonight, is essentially a double autobiography and travel memoir, as each of these eminent thinkers sought to understand their own national identity and their relationship with each other's national cultures. It provides a very different perspective to the ones which have dominated media attention in recent years. I enjoyed reading the book immensely, and I'm sure many others will too. We have copies of the book for sale here tonight at a discounted price, and I encourage you to avail yourself of this opportunity. So David will talk for about 30 minutes, after which there will be an opportunity for questions. If there are questions from the online audience, it's requested that these be sent through the chat function on Zoom. We will finish the event at 7 p.m. We are truly honoured to have David talk to us this evening. Please make him welcome.
Thank you very much, Graham, and thank you AIIA for hosting the event. It's wonderful to be here. And Karen and I have come up from Melbourne, and your weather, I know your weather hasn't been perfect, but it's a whole lot better than the weather we left in Melbourne, I can assure you.
We tried hard.
Yes, well, you did very, very well. I did request it, and
Yes.
you delivered.
Yes.
It's a pity that Li Yao can't be here this evening. He is in Beijing. He will be sitting, it's about, what is it now, here, 6 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Beijing. It is a hot and humid day. He'll be sitting in his small apartment, very neat, very tidy, translating his 41st Australian book, which is Thomas Keneally's The Dickens Boy. Now, I think the first thing we must acknowledge is that this is a tremendous achievement, really. I mean, it's a remarkable thing. I haven't reached for the Guinness Book of Records, but there must be some kind of record around translation. But Li Yao has set a record for translating Australian writing into Chinese that no one will surpass. It is a record that will last for as long as humanity lasts, I think, which may not be terribly long, of course. But so he'll be there translating Keneally, and he's translated Keneally before. He has been awarded honorary doctorates from the University of Sydney and from Western Sydney University for his work, and that's something that he greatly appreciated. But it is just an astonishing achievement. It's a kind of Zen discipline for him, I think, now to translate. He sets himself a number of characters per day. He says he's getting better at it, and why wouldn't he after all this time? And he just does it with a kind of discipline, focus, and concentration that's entirely admirable. I'll say a little bit about how he started on this journey. He went to Inner Mongolia Normal University, which is located in Hohhota, and some Australian teachers were sent there in 1980, just after the Cultural Revolution, 6 of them. And they were sent by the Chinese to Inner Mongolia because Australians were known to be tough. And in fact, they needed to be, because Inner Mongolia was a fairly tough place, and it can get to -30 and -40 in winter. So it's a bit on the chilly side. And a woman called Alison Freer, Alison Hewitt, gave Li Yao a copy of Henry Lawson's short stories, in which there was The Drover's Wife. And he read The Drover's Wife. This is a person who had learned all of his English from the text, by the way. I think his first encounter with a native speaker was probably when he was in his 30s. So he learned the language from the text. And he also says jokingly that he's a great translator who can't speak English because he didn't have much opportunity to do so. But he loved The Drover's Wife and saw connections between the landscapes of outback Australia and the grasslands of Inner Mongolia. So in a sense, he was drawn to the landscape and to the story. And that was published in a journal called Grasslands, which was the only literary journal in Inner Mongolia at that time. And then he subsequently went on to his astonishing career in translation. He says that, in fact, he didn't have much of an appetite for translating or an intention. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a mission statement. There was no mission statement. Or as I don't like to call it, a vision statement about having to translate Australian writing. But as he got into it, he realized a couple of things. And his first impulse, I think, was simply a strategic one, that there weren't a lot of people translating Australian writing into Chinese. And having an eye for opportunity, he thought that was a chance for him to get a foot in the door. But as he got further into it, he became attracted, he was attracted to the language, to the landscapes, to the stories. He also translated quite a lot of children's literature, and the book goes into his upbringing and the ways in which children's literature were important to him. So he's translated Dot and the Kangaroo. So we got the illustrious names, we've got Patrick White, Alexis Wright, Alex Miller and so on, but we've got Dot and the Kangaroo, Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, which is pretty serious translation challenge, I would think. The Magic Pudding and so on. So he's had a serious commitment to the translation of children's literature, which he believes is very important as well. Now, Li Yao and I are both roosters, according to the Chinese zodiac. And the deep scholars of the Chinese zodiac, the profoundest thinkers, all agree, they're in total agreement that the rooster is alert, clever, and enterprising. Some of the lesser known thinkers on this subject also say that the rooster is vain, pompous and prickly, but that of course is wrong. That of course is wrong. Now, I shouldn't actually say this, but my wife is a pig, but I'm speaking here of the Chinese zodiac, and she's a fire pig, and Karen was much involved in this project as well. So it's the two roosters and the fire pig. I was born late 1945, and Li Yao in early 1946. So we both fall under the spell of the rooster. And but that, of course, was not what particularly connected us. As Graham mentioned, Li Yao and I met in 2012 in Beijing. I was attending a conference at Renmin University, and Li Yao was there. He's quite a shy man. He didn't trust himself forward at the time, but he knew that I was about to take up a position, the inaugural BHP Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University, soon thereafter in the following year, February of the following year. And again, I think it was the strategic side of Li Yao that decided that this would be a good opportunity to translate my book, Not Dark Yet, A Personal History, which was published by Giramondo in 2011. So he introduced himself, said that he was about to do this, and I'd known of him as a translator, but had never met him, and was tremendously pleased actually that he was doing this. And I just like the idea of the two old gentlemen settling down over the text and going through it. And just as well that he did, because there were certain passages that needed clarification. In a wry and wonderfully witty moment, I happen to mention that my dear mother, departed mother, who rejoiced in the name Glasson Maud Wallace Vaughan Walker, was very fond of the singer Mario Lanza. And Mario Lanza evidently had qualities that my father, Gilbert J. Walker, did not have. He was a country boy, good at cricket and shooting rabbits, but he didn't have quite the same Latin appeal, I think, of Mario Lanza, and certainly not the same singing voice. So I wrote in the book, there was a line in there to the effect that a reference to my mother's affair with Mario Lanza. And we were traveling across Inner Mongolia on the train, and Li Yao leaned towards me and said, David, can you explain how your mother had an affair with Mario Lanza? And I realized immediately that the Chinese version of Not Dark Yet was going to be a far racier volume, kind of bodice ripper, in a way that my original text wasn't. And I sort of hesitated before correcting him on this subject because I thought the Chinese readership would be much greater in the version that he was planning. But we corrected it. But it was a wonderful experience actually to travel with him and to go over the text in detail. And we both love words, and we both love that experience. And at the end of the process of translating it, he said that he would like a book like that about his family. Not again, it's partly my story, but it's more the family's story set in the context of Australian or South Australian history, actually. So as an historian reflecting on what family history should be or could be if an historian bothered to do it properly, says he rather grandly. And so at the end of that, he said he'd like a book like that about his own family. And I rather rudely pointed to a chair and a computer and said, well, that's all you need. Get on with it. But for various reasons, he thought that wasn't quite the way to go. And after some discussion, we decided that we do it as a collaboration. That Karen and I, would travel with him. One of my responsibilities actually as chair, I should chip in here. You'll notice there's no text here, right? Don't be alarmed. One of the responsibilities, apart from teaching at Peking University, which was fantastic and I loved it dearly, was to visit as many of the Australian studies centres that we had in China as possible. And at that point, there were almost 40 of them, somewhere between 35 and 40, depending on how robust they were at the time. So as chair, I was required to visit as many of those centres as possible and offer encouragement, support, and so on. And Karen and I would have got to about 25 of those centres, a number of them more than once. And Li Yao was a keen traveller, and he was always happy to find a good reason to accompany us on a number of these journeys. So we did a lot of travelling. And then he said, well, how about this book about my family? And we'd heard a little about the family and a little about the story. But once we'd agreed to do it, the story started to emerge about his family. And his grandfather, Li Yao, and there's a beautiful photograph of Li Yao in the book. It's like a Rembrandt portrait, actually. And it's a photograph that survived from probably the 1930s, remarkably. Had been a fairly low-key tenant farmer in Inner Mongolia in the 1920s. He was farming the land for a merchant living nearby in Datong. And so he started with nothing. The family had started with nothing. And the grandfather was one of these people who could do everything. And Li Yao joked about this because we're academics and can do nothing. You know, we can't fix anything or do anything like stonemason or woodwork, or you wouldn't want us doing any of that. But we both joked that we had grandfathers who were extremely skillful in these ways. But Li Yao, his grandfather, was a stonemason, carpenter, farmer. There's nothing that he couldn't do. And across a 20-year period, he accumulated land. He was extremely frugal. Li Yao says he's stingy, extremely frugal. In August, when they have the Moon Festival, most families would get mooncakes to celebrate. Li Yao cut them in half for the family, so you got half a mooncake in the Li family. The expensive grains and products were exported, to cheap ones went to the family. So tremendous frugality, really, and a lot of saving. And he accumulated land and money. Died in 1946. Bestowed some of the land on the sons and some of the money. And of course, come 1949, they're landlords. And on Li Yao's mother's side, teachers and intellectuals. So these are two pretty unhelpful labels to have after 1949. And as we travelled with Li Yao, we came deeper into his story of the Cultural Revolution and what that meant for his family. And it meant for the parents that they were ostracised and identified for criticism, available for criticism, and were criticised. It meant that he was the son of a landlord, and there were various obnoxious and cruel labels attached both to the parents and to him, stinking number nines and so on. So there's a lot of dogged whelps. So there's a lot of very nasty and derogatory language attached to the family, but there was also, punishment and fairly constant criticism, self-criticism and criticism. Now, I'm pretty sure that a lot of these stories were not ones that Li Yao had told many of his Chinese colleagues, and I think one of the responses to the Cultural Revolution was, in his case, extreme caution about who he spoke to and what he said. And when the book was sent to his daughter, who lives in Canada, she cried at a lot of it because she hadn't known it. It was a story she hadn't known. And so I think Li Yao, fortunately for us, for Karen and I, he found in us people he could trust, and people who would not tell on him. Although you might ask, what am I doing here now? But he agreed that the book should reveal the story, and he says in relation to that he's an old man now and he wants the story told. So it's a kind of testimony about that experience. And that experience was, across the 10 years of the Cultural Revolution, quite a grim one, and I can say more about that in question time if people are interested in that. I was interviewed by Geraldine Doog on Saturday Extra, which I was very pleased about, and she asked a question: why does Li Yao still live in China? I thought it was a very interesting question and a surprising one in a way, because the bitter experiences that he had were certainly searing in many ways, and there were awful things happening. But from 1979, things have improved very dramatically. Li Yao's life and circumstances have improved a great deal. So for the last 40 years or so, he has benefited, as so many Chinese have, from the improving economy, from the opportunities to travel, from the opening of China and so on, for the educational opportunities that have come along. So while the memories are very bitter ones, and I think cut very deep, the subsequent experience from 1979 onwards has been really quite a positive one, and Li Yao can feel proud of many of the things that have taken place in China. So I think I said that he was a Chinese patriot. I didn't ever see him waving a flag, but he loves China. He lives in an area that's surrounded by fabulous restaurants and great opportunities for living life well, which he does. He travels extensively. He loves the country. He loves the landscape. There's no reason, I think, why he'd want to leave. And in any event, feels that China is his country, and it's the place that he wants to live in and serve, and in the way that he can as a teacher. But the book was also for us a way of weaving together the two stories. His story is the dominant one, and mine is a kind of counterpoint. And it seemed to us, and it was more Li Yao's suggestion than mine, believe it or not, that the two stories would work off each other and would each illuminate the other. And I think that's right. I think they do help each other. but woven into that fabric as well. A lot of weaving metaphors here. I couldn't weave to save my life, Graham, but I'll use the weaving metaphor. The other theme running through the story is the connections between Australia and China from the late 19th century through to the present. So I'm interested, as you indicated, in Australian responses to Asia and Australian perceptions of Asia and Australian responses to China and perceptions of China. And those interactions have been going for a long time. So we were lucky enough to find quite a few Australians who travelled through those parts of China that we were interested in, which are primarily northern China, Inner Mongolia, Shanxi Province. So we're not doing all of China, we're doing a part of China that many Australians don't know a whole lot about, I think. So, and one of the people that we were so pleased to find was Mary Gaunt, author of A Woman in China, published 1913, related by marriage to Morrison of Peking. Well, there's a family connection through marriage to Morrison. I think Morrison probably said to Mary, look, if you're ever in Peking, you know, which is kind of thing you say, if you're ever in Peking in 1910, if you're ever in Peking, just drop in. Mary did. And I think George Ernest was a little bit shocked by this. But so Mary came, and Mary went into Shanxi Province and into the countryside that Li Yao's family had come from originally. So let me say, how are we going for time, right?
You're going okay.
Going okay. Yes. Can you be more precise than okay? 10 more minutes. Good. Okay. So Shanxi Province is really important in the Li family story because in the 1870s, there was a dreadful drought in northern China and an ensuing famine. Shanxi in 1870 had a population of around 17 million people. About a third of them died from starvation or disease, or they left Shanxi Province altogether. And it took 100 years for it to recover down to 1970 before it returned to its 1870 population. Absolutely devastating climatic event. That climatic event, interestingly, was a global climate event, and it affected the part of the world that my family lived in, which is northern South Australia, Burra, and where it produced devastating drought and famine in northern China. It produced unseasonable rainfall in northern South Australia. So a lot of the people in that part of the world thought that, in northern South Australia, thought that wheat farming was a real possibility. Goyder, who was the Surveyor General in South Australia, said no, 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 no. And he's the person who created Goyder's line, which is the line of rainfall. It says above that line, less than 10 inches of rain a year, and below that line, a little bit more. Don't on any account try to grow wheat above the line. And people at the time said, rain follows the plough. We know better, and off they went. And they had these wonderful seasons, which are related to this climate event. So we kind of tied them together. But the other thing that surprised me a lot was that in the South Australian papers, there were requests for famine relief for China, including in the Walkers' ancestral home in Burra, which divided the community up into various segments, and the clergy of the town went out and collected money for the famine victims of northern China. So these little tie-ins are part of the story as well. The way we inhabit a connected world, whatever we think about the world we're living in, and whatever we think about the divisions in that world, we share a common humanity and we share the globe, and we better start doing it rather better than we are. But Mary went into Shanxi Province, and she went very close where the Li family had been farmers across a number of generations. And one of the little tussles, one of the stories that Li Yao and I had, or one of the small battles, was over whether we could find the ancestral village of the Li family in Shanxi. And as a historian, I believe there's stuff called evidence, and if you look hard enough, you'll find some. And as a more literary gent, Li Yao says that you make it up if if you can't find evidence, and it's much more relaxing and you don't get quite so stressed. So we had a little battle over this, and eventually I persuaded him that we better have a look. You better see what we can find. And he talked, actually, one of the things he did was talk to an elder, to a half brother, who could remember a cousin traveling in the 1960s to try and find the ancestral village. And he'd been a victim of the Cultural Revolution. He'd been a teacher, he'd been ostracized. And so he set off to find the village. And there was in the family a memory of what it sounded like. So off we went to Taiyuan and various other places looking for records. And eventually we found the village of Li Sanchuan. Tiny little village, perfect Chinese village, chooks and kids everywhere, dirt roads, crumbling old courtyard houses, and lots of watermelon. So we sat down in Li Sanchuan, and it was clearly the village that the Li family had come from. They'd left there in the late 1880s, 1890s for Inner Mongolia, where land was being handed out by the Qing dynasty at pretty cheap prices because they wanted to colonize the grasslands. So off they went looking for more opportunities. So the discovery of Li Sanchuan is where we sort of open the book, and the story of the cousins, which is a really disturbing story of someone who is really talented, capable, gifted musician, a bit of a ratbag in Australian language, prankster, didn't know when to shut up, didn't quite know how to keep his mouth, disciplined, and of course fell out with the authorities in a big way. And that was a portent of things to come. So the story weaves in both Li Yao's narrative, my own South Australian counterpoint, if you like, and then the larger history of Australia-China connections and relations and the ways in which the two countries have interacted, both positively and otherwise. And it ends up with some comments about the bilateral relationship, but not a huge number, because I thought there are so many books about the bilateral relationship, really, we don't really need another one, and especially not one from me. But we did need, I think, another book about, or a different kind of book about the Australia-China connection, the Australia-China relationship, the longer story and the longer history. So that's pretty much where the book landed, and that's what its purpose was, and also to try and etch in the experience that Karen and I had in trying to understand where we were, what is, and just like Peking University campus, which of course Colin knows very well, but it's a campus, it's got beautiful gardens and lakes and so on. It's a very attractive campus, but it also has a very intriguing history, both a fascinating history in terms of its relationship to the nearby Old Tsar Palace, but also to the Cultural Revolution and some of the dreadful events that took place there in the 1960s. And so it's a story of us also kind of being there, but not always understanding what we were looking at or what we were seeing, and trying to get a better sense of that. On being there, of course, I'm also I've been influenced by a number of great Orientalists, including Biggles, James Bigglesworth, who was a considerable Orientalist, and he was once asked how he knew so much about the East, And he said, I've been there. On that note,
Well, thank you, David. There are so many questions that I'm sure that we all have. But David, as you discuss in the book, and as you have mentioned briefly, the book goes into some of the quite confronting experience of Li Yao and his family during the Cultural Revolution. And as you said, no doubt gave you pause to think, is this wise to be divulging this on Li's behalf? And it's a very brave thing for him to do, to talk about a fairly difficult part of very difficult part of history. But as David said, you know, Li went through that very, very harrowing period of history, and then in the 80s started to become interested in Australian literature. And you might talk a bit about how he experienced his first visit to Australia in 1988, because you know, he was coming from a very, very different world.
He was indeed. Yes.
So,
Well, that's right.
yes.
That's right. Well, yes, he came. His first visit. There was an Australian literature conference, and he was invited to it. And he came along in 1988, and he met Patrick White actually on that visit. And there's a photograph in the book of Li Yao with Patrick White, and they sat down and Manly brought out the tea and they had a nice time, and they talked about literature being universal and no borders or barriers. And Patrick White said he was very frail and would never get to China, but he felt that he visited China in Li Yao's translation, which was a kind of nice touch. He also met Don Walker, no relation of Cold Chisel, in a pretty seedy part of King's Cross, which must have been quite a challenge in itself for someone fresh out of China. He was also very impressed by the developments that he saw in Sydney. You know, tall buildings, hot water, running hot water, and so on. And but he now says that China's got a few tall buildings too, so he's rather less impressed by tall buildings now than he was then. He also visited Rodney Hall on the sort of south coast and met an Aboriginal figure, a custodian of the local land. And I think that's where an interest in Aboriginal literature and society, culture developed. And he would later, of course, translate Alexis Wright's Carpentaria and the Swan Book, both pretty difficult books actually to translate. And but there's a consistent interest, I think, in Aboriginal history, and some of those. He's also been instrumental in having some of those children's stories, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, translated into Mongolian. So there's another kind of dimension to this. Not that he doesn't do the translating into Mongolian, but people in Inner Mongolia at Inner Mongolia Normal University do that. So that was the first trip that he made, and I think it was the point at which he really decided that translating Australian literature was his calling, if you like. And he loved the landscape. He came to Melbourne and saw the Chinatown in Melbourne. There's an archway there with a kind of rising moon, and his mum's name, Li Yao, a rising moon. So he thinks that his mother is calling to him in Melbourne. So he always goes to Chinatown and looks at the archway, and his mum talks to him. And the other, I might actually point out here, there's no relationship to your excellent question, Graham, but I'll continue anyhow. But I mean, one of the really wonderful things about the experience we had with Li Yao was that we were taken into so many off the beaten track places and had so many experiences that you would not normally have or expect. And one of them was to visit his mother's graveside in Inner Mongolia. She died at the age of 96, and she must have been a formidable, we just missed meeting her, must have been a formidable woman in so many regards, given what she went through. And she was one of the last women to suffer bound feet. The Shanxi Province was remarkably backward in that regard. And so her father insisted on bound feet. And oddly enough, his father was totally opposed to it as a practice. A tremendous row in the family over this. And they tried to correct they tried to undo or reverse the damage, but couldn't do so. So she lived to 96 with damaged feet for the rest of her life. And but a remarkable, tenacious woman and a great figure in Li Yao's life. And so we went to the graveside, and he was there with his sister, and Karen and I were there. And I grew up in a Methodist family, and we know that emotions are incorrect things to display, certainly in public, but almost at any other time. I mean, I know, try not to have them. And Karen will sometimes say that I've succeeded. but one of the astonishing things there was how open the grieving process was. You know, both Li Yao and his sister were addressing their mother directly. They were speaking to her directly. And neither of us speak Chinese, but there was an extremely disconcerting moment when it became clear that Li Yao was telling his mother, explaining the presence of the two foreigners. You know, what were they doing there? And they were there because they were helping Li Yao write a book about the family. And I kind of realised at that point we were in a fairly irreversible process. You know, there was no backing out of this. But it was again a revelatory moment about just different cultural practices, different beliefs, different ways of going about, you know, mourning and grieving and commemoration and memorialisation and so on.
Just before I hand it over to others, the title of the book, Happy Together, has a particular connotation. Can you explain?
Yes, it does. I mean, it's of course a reference to the extremely robust bilateral relationship which we have achieved over the last 50 years. But it has another, and I think the primary meaning is actually goes back to the Cultural Revolution story that we were talking about. And as I had occasion to mention on in another event, I'm an authority on traditional bridal pillows in China. This will come as a surprise to you. But the bridal pillow, the characters happy together, were inscribed or woven onto or embroidered onto the pillow, either by the bride-to-be or by aunties or grandmothers or other members of the family. And it was meant to be an auspicious sign or occasion to grant the newlyweds a happy life, longevity, and all the things that Chinese people want: longevity, prosperity, and so on. And so Li Yao's mother had such a pillow, which was part of the family memorabilia, if you like. And when Li Yao, as a young man, went to Inner Mongolia Normal University, left the hometown, went off on his own to the university, his mother gave him the pillow as a memory of the family and as a kind of sign of the family staying together, the family holding together, and also gave him a bag of oats. So he went to Inner Mongolia University at a time when the political heat was rising around the whole Cultural Revolution situation and the demand to be redder and more revolutionary intensified. And people in his dormitory noticed that he had this pillow with characters happy together on it. And they said that that's old thinking, old thought. And old thinking and old thought, of course, referred back to feudal kind of customs, and that the revolution was the new China as opposed to that. So he was instructed to cut the characters out of the pillow. So he borrowed a pair of scissors and cut them out and gave them to the PLA authorities who were supervising this undertaking, and they destroyed it. So there he was as a young man, kind of trying to get a restful night's sleep on a mutilated pillow that kind of reminded him of the family's, the family of the family as a landlord family, and that they were on the wrong side of the revolution, and that he was, as I say, a dog's whelp who was unworthy of being taken or respected through that period. So it's one of the stories. So Happy Together is both a reference, as I say, to the bilateral relationship, but it's primarily a reference to an episode in his life which was so very painful for him, and clearly painful now, years later. I mean, he hasn't forgotten how dreadful that was.
Thank you. Now, questions. Any questions from the floor at this point? David.
Yes, David Costello, I'm the Secretary, AAA, Queensland.
Good.
Looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Australia-China relationship in the past 5 years has gone from one of great promise to one that's fairly prickly and difficulty.
Yes.
Military closenesses and trade embargoes. How do you feel about this worsening of relations? And do you know really how Li Yao, has he had any comment? Has he had any idea about what's happening with the relationship and conveyed that to you?
Well, he's very troubled by the worsening relationship, because he spent so much of his time in the area in which he is an authority and an expert, trying to improve relations and have Australia better known to Chinese people. So for Li Yao, I think, and for so many of his colleagues in the Australian studies community, that deteriorating relationship is a particularly painful experience, because many of them are pretty fond of Australia and are well disposed towards Australia. They've made Australia their area of study. So for him, it's a pretty painful experience. As I said, he's not a person who shares political views very readily, and I think that is a reaction to what he's been through. I mean, the family always thought that politics was so dangerous, that they're all, whatever the politics was, they seemed to be on the wrong side of it, so there was a particular wariness about getting too explicitly involved in anything political. But I think one of the points I make in the book, actually, and it goes to my interest in this story, we hear, and coming into the election, we heard that it was China that had changed, not Australia. That most, and a lot of it was what Xi Jinping had been up to, and a tightening in all sorts of ways, and a more assertive posture and so on. All of which I think is true. But in Australia, we haven't been terribly good at looking at our own cultural baggage around this question. And so there's when you do buy the book, you'll find a very rewarding chapter towards the end on contagions, which is talking about the ways in which we have always thought, or not always, but have tended to think of China in negative in negative ways as being threatening to Australia in one way or another. And I've been particular as a historian, I've been interested in invasion literature and the ways in which invasive Asia, as I call it generically, but also China in particular, is often configured as invasive. And that's both a military disposition, if you like, or argument, but it also goes to the question of China just being so much more prominent. I mean, can't they go away? Can't they kind of leave us alone? Why do they have to be so intrusive? So there's a sense in which we keep being intruded upon by China, and China keeps thrusting itself into our world in ways that we dislike. And I say somewhere in there that Australia has had a very significant distrust of geopolitical China, while often having a quite being warmly disposed towards individual Chinese. So it's geopolitical China that we often have trouble with, but we don't look at that. We don't look at that history. We don't consider the ways in which we've been conditioned, if you like, to see Chinese actions, Chinese conduct, and Chinese behaviour as malevolent or ill-disposed. And I think often in the debate, you know, like when we came to that question around the 14 demands, there's quite a discussion around that. I mean, whether China was actually issuing demands in quite the way that we imagine them to be, and was this a direct challenge to Australian sovereignty? Was the language a bit different? Was something slightly different being said and something not quite as confronting? So there's often a tendency, I think, to turn the discussion towards that they're up to no good and we are blameless. And I think a more balanced discussion is needed there, and a more open recognition of our own, you know, historical baggage when it comes to how we've looked at both rising China and rising Asia more generally. I'll just add this final point. I was very proud of the fact that actually Karen made this discovery for me, but I'll claim it, that when we recognised China in 1972, the Chinese economy was twice the size of Australia's. And now, if our maths is correct, and there's every possibility that it's not, it's 12 times the size of Australia's. So while the Australian economy has grown considerably since 1972, we've been consistently outpaced, of course, by China's growing economy, and that goes to the theme of the giant. It's the giant, and it is a giant. It was a giant in 1972, but if it was a giant in 1972, what is it now? And I don't think we've actually spent enough time educating our population to the fact that this is an irreversible change in our world. You know, that this is not the world that most of us grew up in. And whatever happens to China, whether China continues to grow or falls back, this is a changed geopolitical landscape for us, and somehow we need to educate ourselves and our students to that change.
Another question.
Will this book be available in China?
That's a very good question. The original intention when we got going on the book, which is around 2014, plan A was to have this book in English, and then Li Yao would translate it or reconfigure it back into Chinese, and it would be based on that story, but it would be in a sense reinterpreted or reimagined. So the plan was to have the English version and then the Chinese version, but the tightening that's taken place has made, and the fact that this account of the Cultural Revolution is not the authorised account, is and one can speak about it actually. I mean, you can talk about this to Chinese people in China, and there's not a huge inhibition around discussing it. There's a difference between discussing something and putting it in print. So Li Yao, I think, has got cold feet about that. I mean, he thinks, I'm pretty sure he thinks it would be a risky thing to do now.
A question online, David.
Yes.
From Louise.
Good.
Dear David, you are, as I recall from Deacon days, very modest about your own contributions to these conversations.
Correct.
I would love you to talk about your own visceral responses to what you and Karen experienced in your time in Beijing when you met and became close to Li Yao. As Australians, with all the baggage of our cultural expectations, what made the most impact on you?
Thank you, Louise. Yes, I am remarkably modest. And frankly, I'm proud of my modesty. I think the thing that struck Karen and I most actually about both the meeting Li Yao and also meeting Chinese colleagues was the enormous generosity and hospitality that we experienced there, and we were always treated very, very well. I don't want to say that the position at Peking University was a bed of roses. I mean, it was like any academic institution, which has, as someone very wisely said, particularly intense politics, because there's so little to fight over. That in a way, the politics of academia can be really quite savage and bitter. But so it wasn't easy working out how the chair was to work with Chinese colleagues and so on. But we were in a sense enveloped by the hospitality of the Chinese. We were welcomed into Li Yao's family. I'm the older brother, Karen's sister. We met the family members. We had a great meeting with the extended family in Hobart. So we were brought in to a Chinese family in a remarkably moving kind of way. We met his younger brother, Li Xin, who speaks no English at all. We speak no Chinese, but we got on famously with Li Xin, who had a very difficult experience, Cultural Revolution experience. And again, going to the experience question, I mean, there was a 50th anniversary of the children who'd been sent from Inner Mongolia into the grasslands as part of their re-education program. And Li Yao's younger brother, Li Xin, was one of those kids, actually. So they were sent way out into the remote grasslands. And we happened to be there at the 50th anniversary of them going there. And so we were drawn in to the anniversary gathering. So we travelled the grasslands with these people, those who remained. It was just an astonishing experience, really. I mean, you could not. I mean, the landscape itself was astonishing, and there's Russia just over the horizon. But meeting people who'd been sent there in the 60s and recalling their experiences, visiting the places that they'd been through that experience was also, the buildings are still there crumbling and so on. But again, just to be taken into Li Yao's confidence, I think, was the most powerful thing, including going to the camp where he was spent almost 2 years being re-educated.
David, we will unfortunately have to draw the formal part of this evening to a close. Look, as I'm sure everyone will agree, the insight that David and Lee provides emphasizes that regardless of the megaphone commentary in politics that one hears, thoughtful individuals can gain a deep and respectful understanding of other cultures and people and develop personal friendships that override political noise. I'll hand it over to David Costello to formally.
Thank you very much, David. You're a great speaker with great insights and sharp wit. I've got a copy of your book there. I'm going to go home and read it.
Good
So,
man.
be fantastic. Right, wonderful photographs too. So many people.
Yes, Karen.
So much
the
food.
photograph.
So many great landscapes. So thank you, Karen. On August 23rd, we have another book launch. This time it's Ian Kemish, the Queensland launch of his book, The Consul. Now, Ian Kemish was a speaker at AWA Queensland last year, and he went down very well. He served as Australian High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea, Ambassador to Germany, head of the Prime Minister's International Division, and head of the Consular Service, and a diplomatic career that spanned 25 years. And his insights were in the book, The Consul, which was released with the Lowy Institute a few weeks ago, and he's going to do the Queensland launch up here, and we'll have copies of that book for sale as well. So keep an eye out for that one, August the 23rd in Kemish, and we've got other events coming up in the coming months, so have a look at our website, and we'll be sending out lots of emails as well. So thanks again to David. We'll put our hands together for him one more time.